Hey, good morning everyone. Welcome to the Facebook Live session for Precision Camera. Once again, my name is Todd White and I am a Lumix Global Ambassador and also an instructor here at Precision Camera. And today's topic, we're going to be talking about 4K and the advantages of shooting video in 4K. And the store asked me to touch on this because typically what will happen is we will shoot in 4K, but we deliver in 1080. And just so you guys know, as I'm looking here at the camera, I've got some people here in the audience as well. So I'm going to be kind of going back and forth, viewing people and peeking around the camera and stuff like that, just to be a little more interactive. But we're going to talk about that today. But what I do want to do before we dive into this discussion, because a lot of this discussion is going to be about how we edit that footage in Adobe Premiere or Final Cut, pick your poison. I personally use Adobe. But I'm going to step back a little bit and just talk about some of the basic settings and some of the options and just make sure we have a decent level playing field when we're filming initially with our cameras. So let's dive in and talk about this. First thing I want to mention is resolution, because obviously 4K is a resolution that we can choose when we're filming. So like for myself, I've got my S1H here and I've got a lot of different variety of resolutions that I can choose. Most cameras are going to have the ability to shoot in 1080 and in 4K. Some cameras that are older may also have a 720 option, which is like our older SD, if you will, style of video. But for the most part, most cameras are going to have 1080, 4K. This particular camera has 6K as an option for it as well in a 3:2 aspect ratio. So a lot of different options, and many people when I teach my basic class ask me which one they should choose. So let's have that conversation quickly to sort of level set. One thing I will mention, and we're going to go ahead and flip over to my slides, if you will. And so right off the bat, there are, as I mentioned, roughly 3 different types of resolutions we're going to talk about. And what I will say is some of the older cameras, when you are switching your resolution into, or if you're shooting in slow motion, like some cameras have a high frame rate option, sometimes those will default, depending on the camera maker, sometimes those will default into a 720. And so I'll mention that as an example. I was shooting a project about 2 years ago using a different camera, and I really hadn't thought that all the way through. And so when I switched my camera to shoot in 120 frames a second, it pushed my resolution down to 720. So when I got that back in for editing, I ended up with a 720 as opposed to a 1080, and I had to up that, if you will, as far as the resolution is concerned with the editing process. So just know that about your camera and understand how that works whenever you're picking your frame rates to shoot in. That said though, so 1080 and 4K. So most of the time when we are delivering our footage, we will be delivering in 1080. Most of the TVs that you have at home are going to be viewing in 1080, and for the majority of the time, YouTube will also be displaying in 1080 as well. But I always encourage people, when you can, please shoot in 4K. And there's a few reasons why, and I have those listed here on my slide. First of all, for me, when I'm shooting in 4K, I like the fact that I have a little bit more of resolution to play with when I go in editing. So 4K to 1080 is a 50% difference in the size of your resolution. Therefore, when I'm editing in 1080 and I've shot in 4K, I've got 50% of space to be able to play with my image without losing quality. And so we're going to look at that in just a little bit and see how that works and some of the advantages for us in doing so. But when you're shooting in 4K, a few things to consider. Number one, more storage is going to be needed for storing that footage, both on the memory card that you use, but also on your hard drive. You will see a fairly significant change in the size of that footage as far as the file size is concerned. Secondly is, can your computer handle it? When you are going through 4K footage, it is going to take a little bit more out of the computer processing power, whether it's the graphics card and or the CPU. It'll take some more processing time and power for that, especially whenever you're scrubbing through and you're having to maneuver that footage in Premiere. And I'll give you a couple of tricks that will help with that. And then also the question, do you really need it? If the only place you are ever going to put your footage is going to be on Instagram, then maybe you don't need it, because Instagram's already going to scale that down even smaller than 1080. I, though, will say I'm of the mindset, shoot it in 4K so you have it, because my last point, you've basically have future-proofed, in a sense, your footage. And so you'll always have that. It's kind of like taking a camera that can shoot 47 megapixels and deciding you're only going to shoot it at 20 megapixels. Because if you can do it, do it. You've got it. It's sitting there in the archive, and you can always come back to it. Now, moving forward, frame rates. I talked about frame rates a little bit. Frame rates, what are frame rates? Basically, it's the number of frames that we are capturing, a number of images capturing per second. One of the big things I'm going to mention to you all to keep in mind is an audio aspect of this. If you are recording footage, and if the audio that you capture is important and you plan to use it synced up with the video, then you really only have 2 frame rates at this point that you can choose. You can choose 24 or you can choose 30. Those are the main frame rates in which your audio can sync up, because when you go into your editing program, you can edit on a 24 frame timeline or you can edit on a 30 frame per second timeline. And that's where your audio will be synced up. Outside of that, then just anticipate you're going to throw away the audio. If you shoot 60 frames a second, 120, and so on, you're not going to be using that audio for anything. Okay? So keep that in mind when you're filming. Let's briefly talk about standard frame rates. The main frame rates that people will be picking from are going to be 24, 30, and 60. Now, I know there's 120 frames a second out there, and that has its purpose, and it is applicable in some situations. I personally am not a big fan of shooting in 120 frames a second. I know it was a big YouTube phase and a fad for a while, but me personally, I just think that shooting somebody walking along in 120 frames a second just takes a while for the shot to resolve, so I tend to avoid that. I will mainly shoot my slow motion in 60, but I'll also shoot it in 30 sometimes. If all I'm trying to do is just smooth out the natural walking motion of someone, and I'm not going to use the audio, then I'll shoot that at 30 frames a second. It's about an 18% difference to get back to 24, and it just smooths out some of the natural motion, or if you're hand holding, it'll just ease a little bit of that movement that you get from hand holding the camera. So for slow motion, I tend to sit at 60 or 30. And then 24, obviously, most of the time, whenever they're doing speaking with someone talking on camera, that's just going to be your cinematic type of a frame rate, and audio will be synced up and everything will look great and wonderful from that perspective. Like I mentioned, the bottom part of this says in the audio note that if the spoken word or the ambient audio is important and has to sync up, then I really need to stay within 24 or 30, depending upon my delivery timeline frame rate. All right, any questions that we have on that whatsoever before I jump into Premiere? Any questions at all from anyone? All right, cool, so we're good out there. All right, let's bump over and move over into my project. So I'm going to go into Premiere, and I've got the latest version of Adobe Premiere sitting up here and running. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be working through a video project that I did recently with Precision Camera. This is when we reviewed the new Sigma 100 to 400 lens that's available in an L mount and also an E mount. And we went out and did a test shot of this. And I shot everything for this video in 4K. And so let's take a look at what this looks like when we start editing this down on a timeline. So I have all my footage organized here. When I organize my footage for editing, I tend to on my footage for editing, I organize it in subfolders, and it makes it easier for me to go find what I need. So typically when I'm shooting a video with Precision Camera, there'll be a section where I've got footage that I've shot that has Justin talking. There's going to be sample images from the camera or lens that we've been reviewing. And then I'm going to have B-roll shots of the camera or lens itself. And then I will also have B-roll of just going around and shooting and testing and so on. And so I organize everything in those particular categories, and then I also will have a graphics image folder if needed, and an audio folder, and then an export folder as well, so everything's not all just jumbled up in there. So I'm very particular about how I organize my footage after I finish up a shoot. So in this case, I've got some shots of Justin talking that I want us to take a look at. So I'm going to run over, I've already got that opened up here. And this is going to be Justin doing a review, the initial review, the intro for our review segment. So I've already marked my in and out points on this for the sake of our time, but I'm going to go ahead and start this up for us. All right, so I've got him talking through this, and I've got this whole section here ready to pull over into my timeline. So I want to stop this, and I'm going to go ahead and bring this over to my timeline. And when I drop it in, I have a notice here that basically says, hey, the clip doesn't match my sequence settings. Should I change the sequence settings to match or keep it as it is? Like I mentioned earlier, the majority of the time we're going to be delivering is in 1080. I shot this in 4K. So my timeline that I set up is a 1080 timeline set for 24. So I'm going to go ahead and just keep my sequence settings. And now take a look at the image that I have of Justin that popped up on my screen. So when you're looking at this in Premiere, the left-hand side of the screen is going to be my source video, which shows it to me in its full resolution. The right side is going to show the video in its zoomed-in delivery resolution, which is 1080. Therefore, I'm punched in on Justin. That is the benefit right there of doing 4K. As you can see by looking at the left and the right, I have got a lot of space to work with on being able to zoom into my image. So whenever I select my footage and I go up and I look at the effects controls, what I will see is right here on where it says scale, it's set up to be at 100%. So I will go and I can right click and choose set to frame size, and now what that does is it takes that and snaps it in to match the 1080 as far as the frame and the aspect of this. Okay. Remember earlier when I mentioned about sometimes when you're shooting in 4K and then you're scrubbing through it in Premiere, there can be a little bit of a lag, especially if the computer is not up to date and fully spec'd out and within the past like 2 years as far as speed is concerned. One of the ways you can help resolve this issue is in your playback windows, whether it is on the right-hand side or the left-hand side. What I recommend is where you have your option where it says full, you get a drop down of half, a quarter, and an eighth. I typically set mine at either a half or a quarter. And what this does on both of these monitors here is that it will set the playback quality to half or a quarter of the resolution, therefore allowing you to scrub through that, watch that, and be able to work with it in a little bit of a lower resolution, if you will. And it will help ease up as far as the taxing on the system itself whenever you're scrubbing through that. So I set both of those. There's another way we can get around this and we can work with this, and that's something called making proxies. And I'm not going to take the time to walk through that here, but that is another process that you could do. I'll just take a quick 30 seconds and just explain what happens there. When you take all your footage and you create proxies of your footage, what it will basically do is it will make super low-res versions of all of your files. It typically creates roughly 960 as far as the resolution is concerned. It'll drop them way down, make them easier to scrub through and to work with. And then what happens is that whenever you do your render and your export, it will take those proxy versions and it will relink them up on the back end with their full resolution versions and then spit out a full resolution clean version of the video. However, the files that you're actually working with for color and transitions and anything else are going to be those super low res version proxies. So that's a way around that. It's a process and takes a little bit of time to set that up in the beginning of the whole editing process, but it could be worth it depending upon your machine. All right. Back to what we're doing. So with Justin here talking, now that I have this set up on my timeline, I have this already backed out, I've set it to my frame size, I'm sitting here working with it in 4K. Let's start talking about how I can adjust and I can play with this 4K footage. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically emulate a two-camera shot, if you will. Because typically in doing talking head interviews, you may do two camera angles. And it may be right next to each other, but you may have one of them set at 24, and you may have one at like an 85 or a 70 or something like that, just to give you a punch in. And part of why we do that is because it's just natural for us when we're talking to have some ums and uhs, and maybe there's some pauses while we're thinking of our next word, and so on. And we want to hide that in the video and not make that obvious. So we want to jump through some of that. So with Justin here, we'll have him talking.
Hey, what's up everyone? Today we're talking about a brand new Sigma product. It is their
So right there where he looks down and he makes his first statement, I may want to go ahead and just do a cut and punch in a little bit to cover that. So what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and increase my timeline size, and I'll bring up my cut tool, and I will cut here, and I'll make a cut just before his next comment. Come back out, and I'll remove that. And now what I can do is I'm going to leave this part of my footage. I'll look at my effects controls to make this work for us. I will leave this part of my footage set at 50%, like I see here. But I'm going to go to this next clip where I cut into it, and I'm going to go and punch in a little bit. And let's go ahead and just say I'll bring this into 65%. And now I've punched into Justin here, and I can go ahead and have him continue talking. And so here, there's a bit of a gap that we can see that sits right here where he talks. And this right here, this little spike is most likely either a bird chirp because we were outdoors or something that was a distraction. So I'm going to go and cut here again. And then I'm going to slide over and I will do another cut. And then I will take out that part and slip that back in. And now I'll come back over to here. And I will then pull this part of our footage. And maybe I won't go quite back to our 50. I'll take this in at 58, and then we'll just slightly go back out. So now what I've been doing is I am using the 4K footage to my advantage to be able to punch in and punch out and take away some of the gaps. So now what we have is this.
It is their 5th DG-DN lens made exclusively for mirrorless cameras. It is the 1:400 5:6.3 contemporary lens made for E and L mount cameras. It's going to come with the lens hood and of course all your rear cap and your front cap, but the tripod socket is...
And so I will do that just back and forth through this entire part of his talking. And so that's one of the tricks by shooting in 4K, because then, like I mentioned, you've got 50% of the footage to play with, and you're able to go ahead and get in there and make cuts and adjust and zoom in and zoom out. Hide those natural pauses, hide the ums and the uhs, and fake a two camera, if you will. So that's one great application of how that works. Any questions that anybody has or comments or anything right now on that? Okay, cool. I'm going to go ahead and delete the other pieces that I had back there. We'll just cut that at that point. Let's talk about another application of how we would use this. One of the other clips that I brought up was this clip here of a lens. So this is going to be the lens shot that I did. I've already got it figured out which section I want to use for our shot. And by the way, if you're not familiar with using Premiere, one of the things you can do is I've gone ahead and marked my in and my out spots for this particular piece of footage. If I don't want the audio to come over, which basically in this situation is going to be audio that's going to be a little bit draggy because this was shot at 60 frames a second. I've already interpreted it to be 24, so my audio is going to have that weird drag motion that's not all synced up and stuff. So I can just grab here where it says drag video only. I can click that and pull just the video portion down, not the audio that's along with it. So I can just grab that. And the reverse of this works as well. If I wanted the audio, but I didn't want the video, then right next to my video clip, I also have an audio meter piece here, and I could just do the same thing and drag that down. It would just take the audio but leave the video behind. So there's a couple of ways we can do that and a couple little tricks there. All right, once again, this particular clip is set at 4K, so at 100% zoomed in, not at my 50. And you can see at 100%, it's a nice clean shot there. I'm going to go ahead and scale this. I'm going to set this to my frame size, so I'm going to go and back that back out. Now, as much as I tried and as hard as I tried, I still have a little bit of a slant to this footage. It's not exactly perfect across and level. So what I'll do is I'll jump over to my effects controls, and I'm going to go to my rotation, and I think it's about probably a 1 degree off, so I'm going to go -1 just to kind of tilt it back over. There we go. So I used a -1 just to tilt it over to the left a little bit. That's straightened out. The main thing I want is this writing right here to be level for me. So by doing that also, you'll know I introduced, and if we can look at this close up, I introduced right here just a little bit of black frame that I don't want to be in my shot. So what I can do is I can get rid of that black frame by punching in ever so slightly. So I'll go to 52, and I've gotten rid of the black frame that I introduced by moving and shifting my footage over some as far as the rotation is concerned. Now, I'd like to go ahead and do a little bit of a zoom in. So we're talking about one of the features here, and I want to do a little bit of a punch in or a zoom in to this spot that shows the measurements here of the lens millimeters. So I will then, because I've been shooting this in 4K, I've got 50% to work with. I'm going to go ahead and add some keyframes. So when I do that, I will start my keyframe in here, which dropped a keyframe in over in my effects controls, and I'm starting at 52. And I'll go to the end of my clip, and I'm going to say that I would like for, at the very end of my clip, to add one more keyframe, and I would like for that to scale in and end up at, let's say, 95, just for grins here. So I'll hit 95, all set to go, keyframed it. So now my shot looks like this. And so while he would be talking or I have music playing, I can do a nice slow punch in to that, and I don't lose any of my resolution in that process. And so now I have basically faked the zoom. Didn't zoom in my camera whatsoever, did not even attempt to do that. It's all purely done by the joy of using 4K versus shooting over in 1080. All right, another thing that we can do if we wanted to, let's say that I did not want to do that and I wanted to change it up and do something completely different. Instead of deleting all that stuff that I just did, I'm just going to pull this back down. I could take this now, and I know that we said that I needed to, first of all, adjust my rotation by a little bit. And let's say I wanted to bring this out, and let's say I want to display this at 70%. Okay, so I can do that. That looks great. Now what I'd like to do is I want to just do an ever so slight bit of a slider move. So I can set my keyframe with position now, and I'm going to go ahead and just move this over until I start to see the black frame creep in, which is right there. So I'll go ahead and put it right about here, set that at 1283, and we'll go to the end of my clip, and I will go ahead and put one more keyframe there, and I would like at the end of my clip to end up at the other side. I'm going to keep on sliding that over, and let's say I want it to end right about there for my shot. So now what I've got is, when we're talking about this, I've got a little fake slider move that shows up in my footage, once again because I shot in 4K and I'm going to deliver in 1080, and I've got 50% of my footage to play with. So we just ran through some basics here. I've got Justin talking, and I'm going to use the 4K versus the 1080 to be able to do punch-ins for someone talking and to hide some natural ums and uhs and so on. And then in our next clip, we then demonstrated how we can use 4K to do a slow zoom without actually doing a zoom. And then the last piece of this was we did a fake slider move using 4K footage that we're going to deliver in 1080. All right, so last thing I'm going to show you that this also works on using images as well. So I'm going to go back over to my project, and we have some sample images. And the one I'm going to use is this one here, which is a shot of a spider that we did. So I'm going to bring this down as an image, which works the same as far as bringing it as a clip. I'm going to go and extend this out. Just need a little bit more time to make sure I've got time to be able to do my zoom in. So we're good there. Cool. So now, once again, we brought this in as the full resolution. And because this is a photograph, then obviously it's a lot more resolution to it than even on the video clip. So I'm going to go ahead and set this to the frame size, which this is what it looks like here. And we've got these black bars, obviously, because we're editing in a 16:9 and this was shot in a 3:2. So we have that there. So I'm going to go ahead just by default and just start this image in on the scale, just a little bit better in on the scaling of this image. I'll bring this to be right at about 22, should get me where I need to be. Let's do 23. All right, cool. So we're going to start it at this point, and this will be my actual image to work with. Let's get back over there. And here we go. So there's my first frame. So I'm going to go and select, and same concept as we've done before, exact same concept. I will start off with setting a keyframe at the beginning, and I'm going to go ahead and go all the way to the end, and I will set my next keyframe. And let's do the zoom on this just to see where this ends up, and I can zoom in. And we could do this. Notice he gets a little bit off center as we do the zoom. So a couple of things that I can do here. I can go ahead and take the zoom all the way in to right about here. We'll take it to be 63% on that. Then I'm going to go ahead and go back to the beginning of this clip. Come on. And I am going to then do a position keyframe as well. We did this earlier. I'm going to combine the two. So I'm going to do a position keyframe here. And then I'm going to go jump to the end of this. And I'll drop in another keyframe at the end. And I'll say that when we're all done, I would like for him to end up back to the center. And I may also want to go ahead and just bring it a little bit more to the center at that point. So now what will happen by doing this keyframe and mixing it up is our shot will then look like this. And as we zoom in, it'll ever so slightly shift the position and keep our spider to be in the center. So there's a lot of different ways that we can use this whole concept of shooting in 4K, but also using that on photos that we shoot and that we want to use within our videos as well. That little effect that we just did with the photo, that technique, obviously you've seen this probably 1,000 times before if you watch PBS at all. You've probably seen that done with the Ken Burns documentaries, and they often refer to that as the Ken Burns effect that you're doing. So that is another technique as far as using a higher resolution footage or photo within your videos and how to maneuver that around and use that to your advantage and add interest whenever you are editing your final product for delivery. Now, here's a little extra bonus thing I'm going to throw in there just for fun. I shot all this footage here in log, so everything looks gray and kind of has that desaturated look to it. I'll get that off of that weird look on Justin's face. He won't like that if that's out there forever. So I shot this in log, and so I need to go ahead and just do a quick grade on this. Depending upon the camera that you're using, there are different, what we call a log to Rec 709, which is a good baseline to reset your color to. And so the benefit of shooting in log, and this is completely bonus to the other topic of the 4K piece, the benefit of shooting in log is I have the ability to play with my shadows and my highlights and color and exposure, and I've got a lot of dynamic range that I can play with now in my footage to really maintain good color balance and exposure balance. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and grab this particular clip of Justin, and I am going to jump over to my color space, and I'm going to go to my basic corrections, and in here I have got a LUT that will take my vlog, and with me shooting on the Lumix cameras, then I'm going to be shooting in vlog is what I'm going to shoot in as far as my log format is concerned. So I'm going to take my vlog and I am going to shift this over and begin to do a baseline color, which will basically be this Rec 709. Sorry for my brief pause and laughter. Justin was looking at me through the window with the wonderful face that I left him with there. And just by applying this correction LUT, if you will, this import LUT, now you'll see that I've got a decent color that I can start with. And when I'm looking at this particular color, one of the things, and I'm not going to get into a big long coloring class here at all, but one of the things I'm looking at is the scopes that I have sitting up here. This particular scope here, notice how I've got this cluster gathering right almost to the middle. That is a really good balance of color overall, but what it is looking is on this particular scope, these cross lines here are my perfect spots to keep closest to the middle to achieve good skin tones. And so I don't have any spikes in any major direction. I've got a little bit into the yellow and some into the green, which makes sense. I shot it outside with a little bit of sun, lots of green in the background, so I have a small shift. But for the most part, that's a really good spot that I can begin with. And then from there, I would make adjustments to taste of what you'd like to do. I tend to like a lot of extra contrast. I also like to add black back into it. And I can also go in and I can bump up just a little bit of the saturation levels and so on. And so as I do that, you'll start to see that I'll get a little bit more yellow introduced, which means on my temperature, I can ever so slightly slide my temperature back, and maybe I'll take it to just about a negative 10-ish. Looks a little better. I would do more of that if we were spending more time on the color side of it, but you get the idea of what I'm doing here. I just wanted you to get a feel for the fact that that footage was shot in Vlog, looked pretty rough, and by just using a plain log to Rec. 709 conversion LUT, I at least get a good baseline. I will caution people that shoot video and edit. It's tempting to go out there and buy a whole bunch of LUT packs and start throwing out all these LUTs and stuff, and those are fun and they're great and they're good to be creative with. However, it can make that footage look a little too processed and not supernatural. So be careful with going out and doing that. When you shoot in log and you convert it to like a Rec. 709, get it to look like you want it to be here. And then if you want to add one of those other LUTs that stylize it a little more, drop that in after you've already made it look really good, and just use that as a little bit of flavor to the food, like adding a little bit of spice to your food. Use it in that way. And so that means when you add those LUTs, don't let them drop in and add them at 100%. Drop them in and maybe use them at 20, 25, 30%, just to stylize it ever so slightly. But don't let that become your primary editing correction tool at all. Be careful with them. All right, cool. Any questions, comments, or anything from anyone online or here? You good to go in here? Yes, got a question.
That LUT that you have there, you didn't purchase it?
So the LUT that I have that I just used, I did not purchase. That is actually available on the Panasonic website, made for whenever you take the Vlog and you convert it over to Rec. 709. Most of your camera makers will have a correction LUT available on their website that you can use then to bring it back to normal. The other LUTs, the more stylized LUTs, those are the LUTs that you'll end up having to purchase. Yeah. Cool? Yep. All right. We're good? Yep. Excellent. Thanks everyone for your time. Really appreciate it. Hopefully this was helpful. I teach a basic video class. I teach an advanced video class. I teach editing as well here at Precision Camera. So be looking for those classes. Obviously right now we're doing them virtually online. So I do teach those from my home and work that through Precision Camera. We're open too. This is the expo yesterday and today, so we've got some of the different camera representatives that are here and some of the vendors. We're doing a few demos, great deals and all that fun stuff here at the store, and love to have you come out and check it out. So thanks again for your time. If you all have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the comments below. I'll keep an eye on the class and the comments that may show up in there over the next couple of days and answer what I can. Other than that, thanks again, be safe, and we'll see you guys soon.